So we just started off with doing a quick introduction to higher order components, and we installed our boilerplate package. I'm going to open my code editor. Let me pull it on the screen. Very good. So I mentioned at the end of the last section that you have already been using higher order components without really realizing it. And once I tell you about it, it's going to start to make a little bit of sense if you're still not familiar with exactly what a higher order component is doing. So in my boilerplate package, I'm going to open up my components directory and then open the app component. So let's play a little bit of make-believe here for a second, and let's assume that we are in the middle of a existing really large application where we want to get access to some piece of Redux state on top of our app component. So in other words, we want to turn app into a container. What would be the process that we would go through to promote a component to a container? Well, we wrap it with the connect function, right? The connect function from React Redux. Let's do that really quick and just see what kind of happens. I'm going to import connect from React Redux at the top. I didn't mention it, but I just pulled off the export default on the class right here. And I'm going to put the export default at the bottom. And then we will connect app. And finally, I will add function map state to props. And let's just assume that we are going to return some property called, how about posts, state.posts. Then we'll pass map state to props to connect. So when I have said several times now, you've been using higher order components without really realizing it. This connect function right here is a higher order component. So we call connect with some configuration option, and then whatever gets returned from connect, we immediately invoke again with our component. So this is a classic case of a higher order component. We're taking the React component we created and we are wrapping it or enhancing or composing its functionality with some helper here. And so you might be saying, okay, well, what is connect even doing then? How is it enhancing our store? What is it doing? So this is where things start to get really interesting, and we're going to talk about that question that might have been burning in your mind all this time. What is the provider up here? What is the purpose of the provider? How do higher order components get involved with this? I'm going to pull a diagram on the screen to help answer that question. So here's a diagram of what's going on behind the scenes when we create a provider and we connect some child components. What's happening is the connect is a higher order component that is specifically made to make communication with the provider at the top of our application. The provider wraps the Redux store, which is Redux, the actual library. It's the object that holds our global application state that is formed by all of our different reducers. The provider holds the Redux store and it watches the Redux store very directly. It says, hey, Redux store, whenever you change, I want you to tell me. Just tell me whenever you change. That's the job of the provider. Then whenever the Redux store changes, the provider takes notice of it and it says, okay, new state, something new just happened. I need to go and update any child components that I have. So provider broadcasts down to any connected component, hey, there was just some change to the Redux state. Something just happened, and here's what the new state is. Take it, re-render yourself, do whatever you want with it. Here's the new state. So connect is a higher order component that's making direct communication with the provider inside of our application, and the provider is what has direct access to the Redux store. So this is just one example of a higher order component. It's a higher order component where it's being used to add some additional functionality or data onto our components, say comment box or comment list, or back in the code we were just editing our app component. So higher order components are components that take a component we write, add some additional data or some additional functionality to it, and then returns the newly wrapped or enhanced component. So in practice, after we use the connect function here, we end up exporting by default the enhanced or composed version of app. And that's a very common pattern that we'll see. We'll see that in a lot of the files we write where we use higher order components, we end up exporting the enhanced or composed version of our apps, or excuse me, our components. Okay, so I only added the connect library inside of this component right here as an example. I'm going to go ahead and do a very long undo here just to get back to where we started, because we're not going to be turning app into a container inside of this particular application that we're going to build. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about what's going on with our provider and the connect function, and maybe have a little bit better idea of what's going on with higher order components, let's continue in the next section where we'll talk about the app that we're going to build to help us understand what's going on with higher order components.